Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
Is recognized.
Any senator who was not in the Senate chamber at the time the oath was administered to the other senators will make that fact known to the chair so that the oath may be administered as soon as possible.
The Sergeant in Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, for the information of the Senate, on my behalf and that of the distinguished Democratic leader, I'm about to propound several unanimous consent requests that will assist with the organization of the next steps of these proceedings. They deal largely with necessary paperwork incident to the trial. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the summons be issued in the usual form, provided that the President may have until 6 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020, to file his answer with the Secretary of the Senate, which will be spread upon the Journal, and the House of Representatives have until 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020, to file its replication with the Secretary of the Senate. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document those documents filed by the parties together to be available to all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that if the House of Representatives wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 5 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020. Further, that if the President wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020. Further, that if the House wishes to file a rebuttal brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Tuesday, January 21st, 2020. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document all documents filed by the parties together to be available for all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that in recognition of the unique requirements raised by the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, the Sergeant at Arms shall install appropriate equipment and furniture in the Senate chamber during all times that the Senate is sitting for trial with the Chief Justice of the United States presiding. The appropriate equipment, furniture, and computer equipment in accordance with the allocations and provisions I now send to the desk and ask that they be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment adjourn until Tuesday, January the 21st, 2020 at 1 p.m.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The Senate, sitting as court of impeachment, is adjourned until Tuesday, January 21st at 1 p.m.
She's not going to say anything as she's going downstairs. We just need a visual. It's most like we need to usher her towards a camera location more than we need to like ask her again.
At this time, we're all secure, so nobody's going to be able to.
I feel like Daniela would know where the car would be.
Yeah, I can't really unplug it.
Yeah. Are those were his staff?
Yeah, these are all the staffers.
Probably.
This is so fun to watch.
long. That's why we're restricted in here.
Yeah.
I was like, light bulb. Fine. I just had
But it makes sense why they're all going that way.
Yeah. No, it's no one's coming right now. You're good. We're taking it long.
Concerned about how this will affect your campaign?
Yeah, I am. I would rather be in Iowa today. There's a caucus there in 2.5 weeks. I'd rather be in New Hampshire and in Nevada and so forth. But I swore a constitutional oath as a United States Senator to do my job, and I'm here to do my job. And I think the people of the United States understand that.
Senator, have you spoken to Senator Warren since the debate? Have you resolved anything there?
No, we haven't spoken.
What do you think it was a miscommunication? That
Look, today I want to talk. Today I want to focus on this very solemn issue.
Senator, do you mind continuing on the mic?
All right, let me grab it here. All right.
Just right there.
All right. Okay, all right. Today is a day we focus on an issue of enormous consequence. It's not a political day, it's a day of solemnity. It's a day of ultimate seriousness. We are beginning a trial for the President of the United States, where very serious allegations have been made from the House that this President has used his power for political purposes in withholding military aid to a foreign country. In other words, in demanding an investigation from that country. So we're at a moment where we have allegations that a president is using a foreign country to undermine American democracy. That is a very, very serious charge. That is what we can, and in my view, must focus on today. Thanks very much.
So,